The government of Mexico has filed an action in the International Court of Justice against the South American nation of Ecuador. That follows what Mexico termed a, quote, violent break-in by the government of Ecuador of the Mexican embassy and acts of violence and harassment committed against its personnel, closed quote. Mexico claims that the incursion, quote, caused irreparable damage to the international system as a whole, closed quote. That assault, on April 5th of this year, followed an attack several days earlier by Israel's military on Iran's embassy in Syria, which killed a number of high-ranking Iranian government and military officials. The U.S. and its allies have grown increasingly hostile, not just to the practice of diplomacy, but also to the personnel and infrastructure that support this alternative to war-making. A prior government of Ecuador, then led by Rafael Correa, relied on the international norms of diplomacy and gave refuge to Julian Assange in its embassy in London. A change in Ecuador's government to a more favorable one to U.S. interests led to the lifting of that arrangement and the delivery of Assange to British police. What does this all mean in the context of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean? For more on that, we go to Esteli, Nicaragua, to speak with analyst Stephen Sefton. Stephen, what is going on?
Well, in relation to this really unprecedented breach of international law and diplomatic convention by the government of President Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, and there's been kind of practically universal condemnation in Latin America itself, even from governments very close to the right-wing ideology of Daniel Noboa, like Javier Milei, for example, the extreme right-wing president of Argentina. Nicaragua severed diplomatic relations. Colombia has, President Gustavo Petro in Colombia has denounced the invasion of the embassy. I think Chile has as well. President Lula of Brazil has. But the great majority of governments in Latin America, and also several among the Caribbean island nations, have condemned the attack on the Ecuadorian embassy. And it's hard to know what to make of that, because the Ecuadorians themselves are being completely defiant, completely resistant. They're not making any concessions at all. They say that it was a matter of their own national security. And perhaps we should just quickly go over what happened. And what happened was that former Vice President Jorge Glass, who's served many years in prison for the alleged corruption offences that he was found guilty of by what was essentially a kangaroo court on the basis of zero evidence. And you may not have realised this, Don, but what the Ecuadorians are claiming is that the kind of psychic influence of former President Rafael Correa.
Mystified, huh?
Yeah, it made him and his colleagues, like Jorge Glass, who was Rafael Correa's vice president, essentially guilty of the corruption offences for which no other evidence was available. And that is literally the case. And so Jorge Glass was sentenced on these completely trumped up charges, did time in jail, was granted I think parole, and also his lawyers have been very active using the habeas corpus legislation to try and set Jorge Glass free from this kind of relentless lawfare-style persecution to which he's been subject. And in the end, he was free at the time, but he decided that his interests were best served by seeking political asylum in the Mexican embassy, which he was granted. And that was at a time just after a disagreement between Mexico and Ecuador, which led to Mexico's ambassador returning to Mexico. And so the Mexican embassy was under the direction of not a full ambassador, but and I think somebody with consul status, and that's where Jorge Glass was allowed to take refuge in the embassy. And what the Ecuadorian authorities did was they mounted a huge police and paramilitary police style operation to assault the embassy, enter the embassy premises, attack Jorge Glass. He was brutally attacked in the course of his detention, and they extracted him from the embassy despite the best efforts of the senior Mexican diplomat concerned, who physically tried to stop the Ecuadorian security forces from extracting Jorge Glass from the embassy, unsuccessfully, obviously, and he was up against literally hundreds of heavily armed paramilitary police. And Jorge Glass was subsequently transferred to hospital, where he seems to, as a result of apparently him having taken an overdose. It's difficult to get the full facts about what happened to him, but he survived whatever medical crisis he suffered, and is now in a high security prison in Ecuador. And so you've had this strong reaction from all the governments, practically all the governments in Latin America, and also overseas, and governments like Ireland and I think Spain also have condemned the complete violation, the flagrant violation, and the kind of they're absolutely, the Ecuadorian authorities are absolutely shameless in ignoring and rejecting the complaints about their violation of international rules, and then claiming that their national security takes priority, which is in complete contravention of all precedent. There are innumerable international statutes relating to the protection of the diplomatic facilities, mainly embassies, but not only embassies, in of other states in a given country. And so, but from my point of view, and I'd argue, I think you're right to relate this flagrant breach of international convention and international law to what's happening in Palestine and Israel's behavior generally, with none of which would happen without the agreement of the United States. And Daniel Noboa certainly will have consulted the U.S. Embassy, and they practically tell him what to do, and before engaging in this flagrant breach of international law and diplomatic convention. And the United States was extremely slow, and it took them something like, I think it was almost 2 days before they issued a very, very mild slap on the wrist to the Ecuadorian authorities. And in fact, Mexico is now taking Ecuador to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It seems that I'd argue that for a long, long time now, the United States has been, and its allies, have been working to undermine international law, to co-opt the United Nations and subvert its activities on political grounds to get for their foreign policy purposes. And the United States and its allies are consistently and deliberately undermining the international system of law and diplomatic conventions and humanitarian conventions and so on, because they unless they're able to mobilize the kind of extremely aggressive actions of the kind that we've seen, as you mentioned, the Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate facilities in Damascus, and now this attack by Ecuador on the Mexican embassy. And there's no other way to describe that. It was an attack by heavily armed paramilitary police on the Mexican embassy. Yeah, absolutely outrageous. But these things are happening as part of a much broader policy because the United States and its allies are no longer able to call the shots as they were able to do until over the last maybe 10 years, in terms of within the framework of existing international law, which they abused as they saw fit.
So what we're looking at is an abandonment of that regime of law, basically in favor of one based on the impunity that comes behind military force. I would have to stop it here, but it's a very troubling development given everything that's going on in the world right now. Stephen, thank you very much for your time, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thanks a million, Don. Look forward to it.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.